All right, in this video, we're going to be talking about the restrictive period, which is the period of time beginning in the 1800s and lasting up until about the 1960s. This period is named restrictive because during this time, most languages other than English began to be restricted or prohibited in schools. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the policies that were connected to this restriction. Before getting into that, I wanted to share this graph that you also saw in the chapter for this week. This is from the Migration Policy Institute. And what I want to point out about this data is that it shows both the number of immigrants in the United States and their share of the total US population. And so you can see during this time period that we're talking about, not only was the number of immigrants increasing, but they were becoming a larger percentage of the US population as a whole. And it was in part because of this dramatic increase in both their number and the percentage share of the US population that many restrictive policies came into place. So we saw these policies that were extremely repressive and also widespread xenophobia and discrimination against many different groups of immigrants during this time period. And I wanted to share a few political cartoons that I think illustrate some of the sentiment that was taking place during this era. Both of these are political cartoons that were aimed at vilifying Asian Americans or Asian immigrants who had come to the United States, often were recruited to come to the United States to work, particularly in the railroad industry and other industries that were taking off. And were often viewed as, there was often a lot of fear and resentment towards Asian immigrants, which then contributed to many policies that barred them from being able to even enter the United States after a certain point. So in the first one on the left, you see kind of this very racist depiction of the Asian American immigrant over Lady Liberty, who has been slain underneath. On the far right side, you see a political cartoon that initially seems like it might be sympathetic toward the conditions that Chinese immigrants were living within. But if you look at the caption that's underneath in very small font, it says why they can live on 40 cents a day, and then in the picture to the right, and they can't. So kind of positioning Chinese immigrants as living in these terrible conditions, but being able to, because that's fine. They're able to live like that. But on the other side, you see this, white middle class family, and they can't afford the low wages that are being paid to the Chinese immigrants. So rather than say maybe we should rethink how people are being compensated, the argument that is being made is that these immigrants are coming in and taking our jobs, and they can live for less money, and so we're not able to compete with that. And so the answer there is, getting them out so that they can get these jobs back. So this was kind of like the discourse around immigration and immigrants in this country during this time period, which again was ironic given that many of these immigrant communities were actively recruited to work in different industries that were growing at the time in the United States. And I think it's important to point out that it wasn't just Asians and Chinese immigrants that were being vilified in this way. I often share this with students because I'm Catholic, grew up Catholic, and even Catholics at this time were seen as a group to be feared. And this is an example of Catholics represented as the bishops represented as alligators, or Catholics represented as alligators, who are coming in and destroying the US school system. And there was this belief that Catholics couldn't be loyal to both the Vatican, pictured here, and to their new country. So they were going to have to choose allegiances, and they would probably stay loyal to Rome. And you see here Lady Liberty again being taken to the gallows. So these kind of very racist and fear-mongering caricatures of different groups of people as these different groups came to the United States. And so a lot of this fear eventually made its way into policies. So some of the policies and laws that were enacted as a result, one were the Chinese Exclusion Act, which made it very difficult for Chinese people to come as immigrants to the United States, beginning in 1882, which wasn't repealed until the 1940s. So a very significant amount of time when it was difficult for Chinese immigrants to come to the US at all. There were the laws then put in place restricting Japanese immigrants, Filipinos, all through the early 1900s and into the 1930s. And then beginning in the late 1920s and extending into the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we see a lot of repatriation efforts for Mexican immigrants, where Mexicans, Americans, and Mexicans were gathered and sent back to Mexico in efforts that were terribly racist, and also deporting people who actually were U.S. citizens. In one effort, 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported, and it was estimated that about 60% of them were U.S. citizens. And many of these same people, again, as with Chinese immigrants, had been actively recruited to come to the United States to work in different industries, like agriculture industry, through programs like the Bracero program. But then again, kind of these continued back and forth pulls of recruiting people to come. And then Operation Wetback was another operation of kind of deporting Mexican immigrants back. And again, 1.3 million were deported. Again, many of whom were U.S. citizens as well. So a lot of this was tied to kind of a broader Americanization movement that was happening at this time period, and was happening also around the time of around World War I, kind of this like coming together of a national identity. And at that time, as I mentioned at the beginning, when a lot of immigrants were arriving in the United States, and so there was this fear that immigrants were going to take over America and fundamentally change the identity of what it meant to be American. During this time, for example, Theodore Roosevelt said, "We must have but one flag. We must also have but one language. The greatness of this country depends on the swift assimilation of the aliens she welcomes to her shores." Very clearly stating that like language is a key part of this, identity as an American, and assimilation is the priority. So we saw some legislation then that aligned with this assimilation mentality. One was the Naturalization Act of 1906, and that was when speaking English became a requirement for becoming a naturalized citizen. The Immigration Act of 1917, which banned immigrants who were illiterate in any language, and it also barred most immigrants who were from the Middle East and Asia. And then the National Origins Law of 1924, which started to put serious quotas on the number of immigrants who could come from certain countries, mostly non-Western European countries. And this was a law that was made permanent in 1929. It was also the first time the term illegal alien was used. And I think it's important to point out for students that prior to this time period, there was a lot more ebb and flow of immigration in this country. It was not nearly as challenging as it is today for someone to immigrate to the United States and to become a citizen. So these quotas that were put in place, these bans, this idea of illegal aliens, is something that is relatively modern for the United States. It's really just been within the last 100 years that these kind of quotas have been put in place. So I think that's important to think about, especially for groups who say, that their ancestors or their family members came here legally. Well, they may have come at a time before there were even these kind of restrictions put in place. All right, so moving towards schooling for immigrant children, as you probably will not be surprised based on some of the policies that were in place, schooling was English only. So a lot of those bilingual initiatives, bilingual education opportunities that we saw in the previous period were removed. So English only, no accommodations for immigrant children, and many immigrants were put into early elementary classrooms regardless of their age. So you might have a teenager who was put into an early elementary classroom. Unsurprisingly, many students dropped out, didn't finish school. And we also saw at this time IQ testing began to become more widespread. And of course, the IQ testing was done in English. So many immigrants were put into special education classes who did not need special education courses because they were being tested in a language that they didn't yet speak. And we also saw the emergence of segregated schools, so kind of schools for immigrants, kind of trying to keep immigrant children away from mainstream classrooms. And I wanted to take a moment to point out something that I appreciate that DeYoung mentions in the book, in the chapter that you read, which is this kind of myth of sink or swim. We sometimes have this idea that, at this time period, children were just thrown into these English-only spaces and they did okay. They must have done all right because generations later, their children and grandchildren are doing okay. But I think DeYoung makes a good point, which is that it wasn't that these children that were being thrown into English-only classrooms were thriving in school. On the contrary, many of them left school. But the reason why some of them were able to be successful is that at the time, the economy was expanding rapidly. There were many jobs that were available that were more low-skilled jobs where people began to be able to earn a middle-class income. And so that explains some of the economic and social mobility that we saw in the early 1900s, rather than this idea that they were successful with these sink or swim English-only spaces. We know from research that throwing children into an English-only space without supports is not the most effective way to serve immigrant students and to ensure their success in school. And as we know from the research on bilingual education, having education in your home language makes all the difference when it comes to literacy learning and academic achievement. So just a quick note there about sink or swim. There was one somewhat pluralist policy during this time. There was a court case called Meyer versus Nebraska, where the Supreme Court overturned a Nebraska law that prohibited the teaching of foreign languages to students in private language classes. This was the case where there was a religious out-of-school class, a religious education class, where the instructor was teaching the Bible in German. And he had been told he couldn't do that, and this ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said that in a private class, a language other than English could be used. So one small win for pluralist policies, but as you can see, in general, this period was mostly assimilationist oriented. Okay, so go ahead and take a moment to jot down what surprised you, what you want to remember, anything that you think is important in terms of language education policies today, and any questions you still have.